With the spreading of the zombie virus coming closer to the border zone of Egypt, Mubarak set out to focus on his air force. This would both have the function of aerial coverage of the border, but also combat effectiveness if need be. Unlike Mubarak's neighbor Gaddafi, Mubarak had not been as harsh with threats towards those showing symptoms. Some of the civilians joked that the focus of the air force was so that Mubarak could flee Egypt if the disease hit their country. If the virus would hit Egypt, it would also soon hit Israel. But unlike most northern African countries, Prime Minister Ehud Barak did not move towards a more military approach. He was of the opinion that the conflict with Palestine and tensions with close vicinity countries made it to where their army was at a well-prepared strength. Though Mubarak did not bare his teeth like Gaddafi did, behind the scenes setups were made for countermeasures. The imposing of quarantine was discussed, mostly due to the fact that Egypt would not be able to close its wide borders. A quarantine would have major consequences to population, economy, and politics, but it might be a solution to contain the disease. In Asia, movements were set up to aid the forces of Europe as both Japan and Korea started the push on naval focus. South Korea's President Kim Dae-jung promised that with their newly reiterated naval training focus, they would be useful both as a combat unit but also invaluable to the evacuation process of civilians from northern Africa. Turkey's Prime Minister Mustafa Bülent Ecevit continued the road towards improving their air units. After having completed the jet fighters program, the increase of bomber production was next. Then, in July of 2001, what everyone was afraid of happened. The first infection in Egypt had been noted. The world's eyes were glued to Egypt and Mubarak. The irony is that most of the Western world forgot the fact that the virus had also spread towards Central Africa and therefore was making its way down south. But the selfishness of the Western world and its tiny perspective on the issue resulted in the biggest change yet. Word got out that Ivory Coast was completely overrun. Fighting in Ivory Coast had occurred in several provinces, and though the zombies often were slow, a huge group had gathered in the thick jungles numbering in the millions. That which scientists and geological experts believed to be the weakness of the zombies had resulted in them forming an unstoppable army of hunger and terror. The Pentagon got word that the zombie horde was on the move. It did not travel as one single unit, but instead split up in large sections. In the first week of July, it was reported that the zombie horde had entered Ghana, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Liberia. All countries pleaded for help. They did not have the military power to deal with this many zombies. President George W. Bush's hands were tied. Almost all Western countries had not foreseen an escalation of this scale. The masses screamed to come to Africa's aid, but the Western leaders said the preparations for an invasion force would take several months, close to half a year. It was not as easy as with terrorists of simply sending a special forces squad, as there was no hierarchy present in the zombie horde. Many countries in Europe said they were going to increase military production, and Holland was one of them. Prime Minister Wim Kok issued another buildup of a military factory to support the production of the motorized divisions. To increase the efficiency, more plans were made to build civilian factories in all of the provinces. The one Prime Minister who was happy and relieved was, to no one's surprise, Prime Minister Tony Blair. How easily moved the emotions of the people could be as the outbreak of the zombie horde and fear it brought with resulted in Blair's political support growing immensely. Gerhard Schröder of the SPD also could not stay behind and issued a military reform. This would increase Germany's military expertise on all fronts. America's move towards military focus came in the shape of new artillery models. The fact that the zombie moved as a horde meant that they were easily targeted by aircraft, but also, of course, by artillery. Turkey, for a brief moment, halted the focus on their military branch to, instead, secure international alliances to be sure that Turkey would not stand alone if the zombie horde, God forbid, came to their doorstep. Italy's Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi looked to the south to develop a multitude of civilian factories. Like Holland's strategy, Berlusconi hoped to increase the efficiency of their military build by doing this. Just as in Greece, some citizens were afraid of the possibility that the virus would spread to their shores via refugees from northern Africa. This was an issue since the number of refugees seeking asylum in non-infected countries grew every month. In Sudan, it was even so bad that President Omar al-Bashir issued a new notion to tighten security at their docks satellite image that the zombie horde was gaining territory in Liberia and that it would not take long before that country would fall as well. It was decided not to publish this news to the masses, but shortly after, news had gotten out that part of the zombie horde had entered Sierra Leone. This raised questions with the public on how well equipped the African armies were to deal with the situation. Sierra Leone's border was small, and they had mechanized and motorized infantry available. Though it was impossible to push the zombie horde back, the soldiers were confident in at least holding their border area and protecting their civilians. In Holland, the movement towards more civilian factories would benefit with the recruitment of a political advisor. Wim Kok thought Frits Steen, a trusted international banker, would have what it takes to get the production outcome of factories up by at least 10%. Since it was well known that being bitten by a zombie could spread the infection, the Dutch government approved the military's plan to upgrade their body armor. Nevertheless, the armor still had weak spots, as some areas needed to be lighter armored to maintain mobility in case the zombie horde would overrun the military and a retreat would be issued. And then halfway through August, the Pentagon's prediction became true, as Liberia was the first country to fall after Ivory Coast. The threat of the zombie horde was real. They actually had the numbers to wipe out entire countries. Though they were still relatively small now, if they continued to wipe out and infect other countries, their numbers could rise to those rivaling the US, Russia, or China. In the third week of August, a glimpse of positive news was released as Switzerland announced to join the UN. Originally, the Swiss government had refused to join the United Nations after the end of the Second World War, pointing to the country's continued dedication to its own neutrality. Now, after a public referendum on the matter, the Swiss government had announced that the country would move forward to abandon its post as a spectator and would now join the organization as a full member. Switzerland stood beside the other countries against the zombies. And the UN could use all the help they were able to get, as shortly after, Ghana fell to the zombie horde as well. In a month, 2 countries had fallen. Some citizens were panicked, calling this the apocalypse or the end of the world.
Because I can see it escalating into something far wider that we just won't be able to stop.
Others were more optimistic, saying that Ghana and Liberia never stood a chance, as their armies were badly prepared. They were of the opinion that the Western countries would be able to easily handle the zombies with the technology at their disposal. Lithuania, after being accepted into NATO, was still tending to the bureaucratic consequences that came with it. Currently, it could not focus on the military power yet. Sweden at the moment had started a political campaign to strengthen its bonds with Germany. Colonists wondered if this were also the first steps for a possible merge with NATO, political gain, or a military alliance. Though the thick jungles of Mali and Ivory Coast did give the zombies time to gather as a horde, it still functioned as a handicap when it came to the fighting. Their numbers maneuvered slower than usual through the thick vegetation. But combat was to their advantage, as they could easily sneak up to unsuspecting soldiers. The area overtaken by the zombie horde was now bigger than several small European countries. Nevertheless, George W. Bush said he was optimistic in dealing with the zombie horde by the end of that year. This gave the citizens in the Western world some reassurance. But little did they know what would happen in the month of September 2001.